The night the curtain was supposed to fall for the 48th time, the air in the Whitmore house felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I was 28 years old that August evening in 1851, but the stone steps beneath my bare feet had been worn smooth by my going up and down them for 3 years, carrying a body that felt older than any number. I knew the way to the basement theater by heart. I could have walked it blindfolded. 8 steps from the kitchen door to the first turn, 12 more down into the dark. A pause where the cool damp of the earth rose up to meet the heat pressing down from the Louisiana night. Then the last shallow stair where the smell changed from wood smoke and boiled meat to perfume, lamp oil, and wine. That was the smell of her theater. Mistress Constance Whitmore's private kingdom, carved out beneath her husband's sugar plantation like rot beneath a tooth. The door stood half open when I reached it, a blade of golden lamplight cutting across the stone floor of the corridor. I stopped there for a heartbeat, feeling the cotton of my dress cling to my back. Sweat trickled between my shoulder blades. Outside, the cicadas screamed in the cane fields and the bayou frogs answered them, but down here the only sound was the low murmur of voices and the faint scrape of a chair leg against stone. "Violeta," her voice floated up through the crack in the door, smooth and lazy, sweetened with wine. "Don't dawdle, girl. Our guests grow impatient when the curtain is late." We were the guests and the curtain both. I knew that. I had known it for a long time. I drew a breath and stepped inside. The basement chamber was not large, but it had been made to feel grand in the way only a white woman with money and boredom could imagine. Oil lamps hung along the stone walls, their glass chimneys smudged by soot. Their flames threw a warm, unsteady glow over everything, turning sweat into shine and fear into something almost pretty. Along the far side of the room, 3 rows of cushioned chairs stood in a neat curve, upholstered in faded red velvet that had once lived in the parlor upstairs. Small tables sat between them, each holding a cut glass decanter, delicate stemmed glasses, a silver bell for calling. Mistress Constance had taken the parlor's softness and dragged it down into the dirt, the way she had done with our lives. Tonight she sat in her favorite chair, the center one in the first row where she could see everything. She wore pale blue silk that gleamed in the lamplight, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in glossy coils. At 45, she still had the kind of beauty that came from never missing a meal and never being contradicted. There were lines beginning at the corners of her mouth, but they were not the lines of worry or work. They were the marks of laughing when other people cried. She held a glass of French wine in one hand and her little leather journal in the other, the one where she wrote down her thoughts about us as if we were a crop to be measured or animals to be bred. Behind her the walls sweated with the heat of the day trapped in stone. Before her, we stood in a rough line, 12 souls waiting for the signal to begin. Marcus was there, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands hanging loose at his sides, but his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Sarah stood near the end of the line, her eyes lowered, her hair wrapped in a scarf the color of cream. Thomas, my younger brother, was against the far wall in the shadows, skinny but no longer boyish, his face set in that blank mask we'd all learned to wear down here. We did not look at one another. Not yet. "Ah, my little troop," Mistress Constance drawled, letting her head loll back against the velvet cushion as she looked us over. "How faithful you are. Not one missing, not one late. I suppose degradation is a more reliable clock than any made in Boston." The men around her chuckled, the shallow, obedient laughter of white guests who never wanted to risk displeasing their hostess. There were 3 of them tonight, planters from neighboring estates, their faces florid from heat and drink. They sat like fat shadows in the second row, shirts open at the collar, hair damp, eyes already glassy with expectation. They did not see us as people standing in front of them. We were no more human to them than the animals in the fields or the cane in the rows. I had learned over 3 years to let my eyes go soft whenever I stood in that room. If I did not look at their faces, if I focused on the light on the stone or the way smoke curled from the lamp wicks, I could almost pretend I was not there at all. My mind would step away from my body, float somewhere near the low ceiling where the lamps clung, where I could not smell the wine on Mistress Constance's breath, or feel her gaze sliding over my skin. But tonight I did not let my mind float. Tonight I stayed fully inside my body, feeling every inch of skin, every beat of my heart, every breath dragging through my lungs. Rage sat under my ribs like a coiled animal, quiet but alive. For 3 months I had fed it on memory and humiliation until it learned to lie still and wait. Tonight I promised it, you will eat. Mistress Constance swirled the wine in her glass and smiled at me. That slow, indulgent smile she reserved for her favorite toys. Come here, Violeta, she said. I have something special in mind for you this evening. My feet moved. They had been trained to answer that voice long before my heart rebelled. I walked across the stone floor, counting the scuffs and stains that only I seemed to notice. Here, a dark patch where someone's nose had bled last winter. There, a faint ring where a wine glass had shattered and been cleaned in haste. This room held our history in small, quiet marks, the kind no one upstairs ever saw. I stopped and, arm's length from her knees, and folded my hands in front of me, my head bowed just enough to look obedient. If she had bothered to look closely, she might have seen the difference. My shoulders were not rounded with dread, but squared with decision. My jaw was not tight with fear, but set with purpose. But people like her did not see change in people like me. They believed we were fixed in our roles, as unchanging as the chairs and the stone. Look at me, she ordered, and I raised my eyes. Her pupils were slightly blown from the wine, giving her gaze a bright, feverish gleam. The oil lamps painted glints along her earrings and the edge of her glass. She smelled of jasmine water and alcohol and something underneath that I had never found a name for. Some sour hint of rot, like fruit left too long in the sun. Do you know what night this is? She asked. Yes, ma'am, I said quietly. My voice did not shake. That surprised me a little. It has been 3 years since you first brought us down here. She laughed softly. 3 years, she repeated, savoring the words. 3 years of experiments. 3 years of performance, 3 years of discovery. You should be proud, Violeta. Few actresses keep an audience so loyal. Her guest chuckled again. One of them reached lazily for the decanter at his elbow. Another wiped sweat from his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief, as if the air itself offended him by daring to be heavy. Proud. That word curled in my stomach like smoke. I remembered the first night she called me down, pretending she needed help sorting old furniture. I remembered the shock of seeing those chairs arranged just so, the lamps trimmed high, her in a dress too fine for an ordinary evening. I remembered how she had explained my special role, how she had watched my reaction with the calm curiosity of a person poking a trapped animal to see how it would flinch. That was the night the curtain rose. Tonight I intended to bring it down. Yes, ma'am, I said again, because that was the answer she wanted. 3 years. And tonight, she murmured, leaning forward, her silk rustling like water, I think we shall try something instructive. Something that will tell us once and for all how strong the bonds of family truly are when placed under strain. My throat went dry. I did not need her to say more to understand what she meant. Her favorite games always circled back to kin, to mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, brothers and sisters. She liked to pull at those threads, watch things unravel, make us complicit in the tearing of our own hearts. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Thomas straighten against the wall. His gaze stayed down, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the only betrayal of the storm moving through him. "Come forward, Thomas," Mistress Constance called, her voice brightening the way it always did when she smelled fresh pain. "You and your sister have such natural chemistry, it would be a sin not to make use of it." The room seemed to tilt just slightly, as if the house itself had shifted on its foundations. For a heartbeat, I could hear nothing but my own pulse pounding in my ears. The lamps hummed faintly. A bead of sweat slid from my hairline down the side of my face. Somewhere far above us, in the sane world where people slept and children dreamed, a dog barked once and fell silent. This is the moment, I thought. This is the night. Everything we had whispered in the quarters, everything we had planned in the shadows of the cane, everything we had rehearsed with careful, cautious glances, it all narrowed down to this. To her in that chair, to us on this stone, to the wine in her hand and the bell on the table beside her that she had not yet thought to touch. "Come, Thomas," she repeated, a hint of impatience sharpening her tone. "Do not make me wait. You know how I despise disobedience." He stepped away from the wall, the way I knew he would. We had not planned this exact moment, but we had known some version of it would come. His face was as still as carved wood. But when his eyes flicked to mine for just an instant, I saw the thing that mattered. He was ready. I turned back to Mistress Constance. Her attention was fixed on us with hungry anticipation, the way a cat watches two birds fighting on the ground. The men behind her leaned forward a little, their chairs creaking, the lamplight catching in their sweaty faces. "Violeta," she purred, "you will begin with—" "No," I said. The word was small and plain, no louder than the answer I had given her a dozen times that evening. For a moment it hung in the hot, lamplit air without meaning, like a note played on an unfamiliar instrument. Then it landed. Mistress Constance's smile did not disappear all at once. It frayed at the edges as if someone had snipped a few threads from the embroidery of her face. Her eyebrows lifted fine and arched. Her head tilted the slightest degree. "What was that?" she asked, her tone light, but the room had already begun to change. The men shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. Marcus drew one slow breath, chest rising and falling. Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of her skirt. I felt my heart beat once, hard enough to hurt. I lifted my chin. "I said no, ma'am," I repeated, my voice steady as the stone beneath my bare feet. "We won't perform for you tonight." The lamps hissed softly. The wine in her glass trembled. Above our heads the house stayed quiet, unaware that in the space of a single breath the roles in the theater below had begun to reverse. I had once believed that hell was a place beneath the earth, where fire consumed sinners and chains bound them forever. But I learned, over 3 long years, that hell can live inside a house, dressed in lace and velvet, carrying a silver wine glass, and smiling sweetly while it watches you burn. When Mistress Constance Whitmore first turned the basement of her Louisiana plantation into her private stage, it was not called a theater. It was just a curiosity, a secret indulgence of a bored woman married to a man who spent more time counting barrels of sugar than looking at his wife. I remember the day it began as clearly as I remember my own name. It was spring of 1848. The magnolias were blooming, their scent thick in the air, and I was still naive enough to think that obedience could protect me from cruelty. That afternoon, Mistress had called for me while the sun still shone through the shutters. I was scrubbing the hallway floor when her voice floated down the stairs. "Violeta," she said, "come help me in the cellar. There's furniture to move." I wiped my hands, straightened my apron, and hurried down, thinking only of work. But when I reached the bottom step, I saw that the cellar was not filled with furniture at all. The lamps were already lit, their light golden and trembling. The chairs were arranged in a neat semicircle, and a rug had been laid over the dirt floor. Mistress Constance stood in the center of the room in a dress too fine for chores, holding a notebook and a quill. "Ah, there you are," she said, smiling that soft, distant smile that never reached her eyes. "We're going to conduct a small experiment tonight. Have you ever performed before?" I shook my head, confused. "Good," she said. "Then we'll see how nature reacts to shame." That was the beginning. At first, it was only her watching. She called it an exploration of human response under humiliation, a phrase she must have stolen from one of her husband's old books. She made me stand before her and strip piece by piece while she wrote notes in her journal. I still remember the scratch of the quill against the page, steady and indifferent as if she were recording the weather. Subject Violeta exhibits resistance to initial exposure, eyes lowered, hands trembling, pulse visible at throat. That night was not as violent as the ones that followed. She kept her hands to herself and dismissed me after an hour, saying, "You'll grow accustomed to obedience, my dear, they always do." But something had shifted inside her and inside me. By the end of that year, the experiment had become a spectacle. The chairs multiplied. So did the lamps. So did the participants. Mistress Constance began inviting other planters' wives under the guise of social gatherings. They came in silk dresses and jewels, sipping imported wine, pretending shock while their eyes gleamed with curiosity. She told them she was studying the nature of submission, and they laughed, calling her bold, unconventional, daring. We became her troupe of unwilling actors, 12 of us in all. She gave each of us roles, though none of us volunteered. Marcus, whose strength fascinated her, she cast as the bull. Sarah, whose beauty made her jealous, she called the siren. My brother Thomas joined later when he turned 18, chosen for the innocence she delighted in ruining. She gave me a name, too, the faithful. She said I was reliable, graceful in my suffering, a natural performer. She said it as a compliment. The theater was her obsession. Every detail mattered. The placement of the lamps, the scent of the perfume she wore, the rhythm of the performances. Twice a week, always after sundown, she would summon us. We were washed, perfumed, and arranged like objects. Her husband, Edmund, knew something was happening, but he chose not to see. He would be away on business during the performances, and when he returned, Mistress would meet him at breakfast with a bright, polite smile and the faintest smell of jasmine on her hands. In time, she began documenting every performance in her leather-bound journal. I saw it often when I cleaned her study. It was filled with observations written in her elegant cursive. Subject Sarah exhibited excellent composure during tonight's experiment. Recommend introducing physical pain to test endurance. Subject Marcus maintains impressive restraint even under public exposure. Hypothesis: strength breeds denial of emotion. Further testing required. Each entry was worse than the last. She was building a catalog of cruelty, a science of humiliation. The basement smelled of lamp oil and wine and the faint copper of blood. It was never clean, no matter how much we scrubbed. The walls sweated in the summer heat. Mice darted in the corners. Above us, the house creaked with the weight of the life we no longer shared. The laughter from the parlor filtered down like ghosts. We learned to disappear inside ourselves. There was an art to survival in that room. One learned how to stand just so, how to breathe shallowly, how to look without seeing. I learned how to let my mind slip away, to watch from somewhere just above my body while it obeyed. I told myself that I was not really there, that the woman they watched was someone else. But afterward, when I lay awake in my pallet, I could still feel their eyes on me, could still smell the wine on her breath when she whispered instructions in my ear. Mistress Constance took special interest in breaking bonds. "Affection," she said once, "is an illusion of weakness. Family ties are nothing but chains to be tested." She delighted in forcing those who loved each other to face one another as tools of her amusement. She paired mothers with daughters, brothers with sisters, husbands with wives. She would watch, eyes gleaming as shame turned to tears, then to silence. "See how loyalty withers," she would murmur, sipping her wine. "See how quickly the soul betrays itself." Every night we died a little more, and she wrote it all down. The years blurred together. The performances became as regular as the turning of the seasons. Sometimes she would end the evening with laughter and applause, praising us like children who had pleased her. Other times she would rage, throwing bottles, striking us with her fan, ordering punishments that left scars. But always, she would call us back again. The theater was her altar, and we were the offerings. There were nights when I believed I had forgotten what it meant to be human. Then there were other nights, brief, fragile moments, when I remembered. When Marcus whispered a prayer under his breath before we began. When Sarah brushed her fingers against mine in passing, a silent gesture of solidarity. When Thomas looked at me, not as a broken thing, but as his sister still. Those moments were the seeds of what would come later, though we didn't know it yet. By 1850, Mistress Constance's cruelty had deepened into ritual. She began experimenting with new instruments, ropes, belts, even hot wax. She said she wanted to study the texture of pain. Her journal filled with phrases like heightened reaction, submission achieved, fascinating collapse. I remember one evening when the lamps burned low and the wine was half gone. She had grown bored with the usual routines. She looked around the room with those bright, hungry eyes and said, "Perhaps I've been too kind. Perhaps they need to be reminded that pleasure and pain are the same thing." That night, Sarah fainted. Mistress laughed and said it was a perfect ending. The days after each performance were hollow. We worked in the fields or the house by rote, moving like ghosts. But even ghosts remember. Even ghosts can plot. By early 1851, something in us began to stir. The quiet endurance that had kept us alive was no longer enough. We started watching her as she had watched us, studying her habits, her weaknesses, her routines. We learned how much she drank, when she dismissed the servants, where she kept the bell that summoned the overseers. We noted that Master Edmund was often away on business during the hottest months. I started writing too. Not openly, I couldn't risk being caught, but in my mind. My mother had taught me to read and write in secret when I was a child. Now I used that memory to record every detail in my head. I catalogued her crimes with the precision of a scholar preparing for trial. Every insult, every act of degradation, every night she made us act out her sickness. I did not know yet what justice would look like. I only knew it had to come. And it was coming. Slowly, silently, like thunder building far away on the horizon. There were nights when the weight of rage pressed so hard against my ribs I could barely breathe. I would look at the others and see the same tension beneath their calm. Marcus's hands would tremble when he polished the silver. Sarah's lips would move soundlessly in prayer. Thomas began to stare into the distance as if he were already seeing something beyond this place, beyond this life. We were no longer actors. We were witnesses. And witnesses, when they have seen too much, must one day speak. The basement became both a prison and a battlefield waiting to ignite. The same walls that had echoed with our cries would soon echo with something else. Revenge is not born in one moment. It is distilled over time, drop by drop, like the syrup from the cane we cut in the fields. Thick, slow, and inevitable. By the end of that third year, Mistress Constance believed she had broken us completely. But in truth, she had done something far more dangerous. She had taught us how to perform, and we would use that performance to end her. By the summer of 1851, even the air around Whitmore Plantation had turned against us. It pressed down heavy and breathless, smelling of rot and river mud, as though the world itself had grown sick from too much cruelty. The cicadas screamed through the long afternoons, and at night the humidity clung to the skin like grief. We moved through those days as shadows do, visible but not seen, breathing but not alive. Something inside each of us had been cracked so many times that the pieces no longer fit together. And yet somehow what remained was harder than before. That was the season Mistress Constance began to unravel completely. Her husband Edmund was traveling more frequently to New Orleans, leaving her alone with her appetites and her sickness. The slaves whispered that she drank wine from sunrise until the lamps were lit, that she spoke to herself in the mirrors of the great hall, calling her own reflection darling. I saw it too, the small tremor in her hand when she lifted her glass, the way her voice would slip from charm to fury in a single heartbeat. She had become her own ghost, drifting from room to room with the faint scent of jasmine and decay trailing behind. But cruelty never dies quietly. It burns hotter before it fades. She began calling for us more often, sometimes 3, even 4 nights a week. She said the performances soothed her nerves. What they did, in truth, was feed the rot inside her. She grew more inventive in her degradation, more obsessed with documenting every tremor of emotion. Her leather-bound journal became her holy book, and we were her scriptures. She wrote after each performance, her quill scratching like a small animal in the silence. Subject Marcus displayed admirable resistance to extreme coercion. Must apply deeper pressure to induce desired surrender. Subject Sarah's tears provoke exceptional response from audience. Retain for future study. Subject Violeta continues to exhibit composure under humiliation. Hypothesis. Intellect is the final barrier. Break it and the body follows. I would see those words later when I was ordered to clean her study. Sometimes I would stare at them for long minutes, my eyes tracing the graceful curves of her handwriting. It was beautiful script, flawless, deliberate. The cruelty looked so tidy on the page. That, I think, was what finally broke something in me, realizing that she saw our suffering not as an accident but as art. It happened one night in late May. She had invited no guests that evening, just herself, her wine, and the 12 of us. She called it a private rehearsal. The lamps burned hotter than usual, filling the chamber with a buttery glow that made the stone walls seem to sweat. The smell of oil and perfume twisted in my stomach. She sat in her chair, her hair pinned high and her journal open beside her. Her eyes were bright, feverish. "Tonight," she said, "we explore the bond between kin." Her gaze drifted lazily over us until it found Thomas. He had grown taller since she first noticed him, his shoulders broadening, his face losing the last traces of boyhood. That new strength seemed to delight her all the more. "You," she said softly, pointing the tip of her quill toward him. "And your sister, the faithful and the innocent. Let us see whether virtue can survive intimacy." The room tilted. My vision blurred around the edges like the air itself had thickened. I felt Thomas stiffen beside me. His hands were fists at his sides. I saw his chest rise once, twice, as though he were drowning above water. Mistress Constance smiled. "Come now," she said, her tone almost motherly. "Do not make me repeat myself." That was when I heard the sound of my own voice say, "Please, ma'am." "No." It was quiet, almost polite, but it stopped the air. She froze, her glass halfway to her lips. For a heartbeat, disbelief crossed her face, then amusement. "No?" she echoed as though I had just uttered a word from a dead language. "Oh, Violeta, you dear creature. You forget your place. You always perform when I ask. I shook my head. My throat felt raw, but the words came again, stronger. No, ma'am, not tonight. The wine glass hit the floor, shattering. The sound was small, delicate, like a bell tolling at a funeral. For 3 years I had bowed, obeyed, performed. I had endured things that stripped away everything human in me. But something inside had finally burned itself clean. It was not courage that filled me then. Courage implies hope. What I felt was simpler, purer. It was the quiet certainty that death was preferable to another moment of obedience. Mistress Constance rose from her chair, moving slowly like a cat preparing to strike. Her silk skirts whispered against the stone. "You will do as I command," she said, each word clipped, precise. "Or you will beg for death before dawn." She took one step closer, then another. Her perfume suffocated the air between us. I looked into her face, so perfect, so painted, so empty, and I realized she had no idea that the power she believed eternal had already begun to crumble. Behind me, I felt the others stir, not moving yet, not speaking, but breathing differently. The kind of breath that comes before a storm. "I won't," I said again, and the room changed forever. Mistress Constance's hand flashed out, striking me across the face. The blow was sharp enough to make my ears ring. I staggered but didn't fall. "You ungrateful little beast," she hissed. "I took you from the fields. I fed you, clothed you, educated you in my own home. And this is how you repay me?" I tasted blood on my tongue. "You didn't educate me," I said. "You broke me." But I remember how to mend. Something flickered behind her eyes, something that looked like confusion. It lasted only a heartbeat before it turned to rage. She reached for the small bell on the table beside her, the one that summoned the overseers. But Marcus moved first. I saw him cross the space between them in a single step, his hand closing over hers. The bell never rang. The wine in her other hand sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the rug. "What is the meaning of this?" she shouted, twisting against his grip. "Release me this instant." No one moved to obey. Sarah stepped to the door, her body blocking the exit. Thomas joined her, his eyes still on me, steady now, no longer the eyes of a boy. Mistress Constance looked around, her head snapping from face to face, but the circle was already closing. The lamps seemed to burn lower, the shadows thickening at the edges of the room. "You think to frighten me?" she sneered, though her voice trembled. "You think I won't have every one of you whipped to death for this?" Marcus's voice came like a low growl. "You'll call no one tonight." Her gaze darted toward the stairs. "Edmund!" she screamed. "Edmund, help me!" But her husband was in New Orleans. Even if he'd been home, no sound could pass through those thick stone walls. She had made sure of that when she built her theater, to keep our screams from reaching the ears of decent people. Now the silence trapped her too. She struggled in Marcus's grip, clawing at his hand. "I own you," she gasped. "All of you. You live because I allow it." I stepped forward then, feeling something inside me settle into place. "You own our bodies," I said quietly. "But you never owned our souls." Her eyes met mine. For the first time in all those years, I saw something I had never seen before. Not cruelty, not amusement, fear. Real human fear. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin and broken. "You can't do this," she said. "If you kill me, they'll hang you all. They'll burn you alive." "Maybe," I said, "but we've been burning for 3 years already." The others nodded, just small motions, but enough. The decision was made. We had crossed the point of no return. Mistress Constance must have seen it because her body went still, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. She whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. And then, in the trembling quiet that followed, a single drop of wine rolled from the table to the floor, striking the stone with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. That was when I knew. The next time this room echoed, it would not be with our shame. It would be with her screams. That night became the breaking point, not just for me, but for all 12 of us. Every humiliation, every forced act, every tear that had been swallowed instead of shed, it all gathered in that single instant like a storm finding its lightning. We were no longer 12 slaves standing before a mistress. We were 12 graves waiting to be filled, and we intended for hers to be the first. The play she had written for us would end tonight, and this time, we would be the authors. After that night, nothing inside the Whitmore plantation was the same. On the surface, the rhythm of life continued. The chiming of the bells from the overseer's quarters, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the hiss of the sugar kettles boiling out in the fields. But under the surface, something invisible had begun to move. It was quiet, deliberate, and dangerous. For years, Mistress Constance had studied us like specimens under glass. She believed she knew our minds, our fears, our thresholds. But what she had never understood, what no master ever truly did, was that the same silence that protects submission can also conceal rebellion. When the enslaved stop speaking, it is not always from fear. Sometimes it is because they are listening. That summer we began to listen to one another. It started with a glance, the kind that lingers a second too long. Then a nod in passing, a word dropped in the right place, a task volunteered for so two people might share the same space for a few breaths. Every move was calculated, every whisper weighted. I remember the first true conversation, the first time the air between us shifted from despair to something sharper. It was late June, deep in the season of storms, and the air was heavy enough to wring water from. The sky above the plantation glowed green-black, trembling with thunder that hadn't yet broken. Mistress Constance had dismissed us early that night, too drunk to stand. I found myself alone near the smokehouse, scrubbing a copper pot when Marcus's shadow filled the doorway. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly, though there was no real concern in his voice, just habit. "I don't plan to stay long," I answered, eyes fixed on the pot. He stepped closer, his voice barely more than a breath. "She'll call again tomorrow, you know that." "I know." He waited, as if expecting something more, and when I didn't speak, he said, "You meant it, didn't you? When you told her no." I looked up then, meeting his eyes. In the dim light from the nearby kitchen windows, his face looked carved from shadow, the lines of his jaw hard as the iron tools hanging behind him. "Yes," I said. "I meant it." A long silence passed between us, filled only by the pulse of cicadas outside. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said, "because we're not going to survive another year like this." It wasn't a plan yet. It wasn't even a decision. It was just two people saying the truth aloud for the first time. But every fire begins with a spark. Within a week, the whispers had spread to the others. Sarah heard from Marcus and Thomas from me. Then the twins, Isaiah and Ruth, who worked in the laundry, then Samuel, who tended the horses. Each conversation was like a single note in a melody that was building soft and slow, but impossible to stop once begun. We never met all together. Not then. It would have been suicide. Mistress Constance's spies were everywhere. Even the walls of that house seemed to have ears. But there are ways to speak without words. We passed messages in folded scraps hidden in the seams of garments. We used the rhythm of our work songs to carry meaning. One verse sung softer, one line repeated twice to signal understanding. Sometimes we gathered in pairs or threes in the smallest hours of the night, beneath the cypress trees at the edge of the cane fields. The swamp air was thick with the hum of insects, and the moonlight lay over the water like pale silk. We spoke in whispers, barely breathing the words. "What if she finds out?" Sarah asked one night, her voice trembling. "She'll have us whipped till our backs split." "Then she'll have to catch us first," Marcus said. "And she won't." Sarah shook her head. "She always does. She knows everything." "No," I said softly. "She only thinks she does." It was Thomas who asked the question that none of us wanted to answer. "What happens after?" he said. "If we kill her, they'll come for us. They'll burn us, hang us, flay us alive. You know they will." The fireflies blinked in the reeds. A bullfrog croaked somewhere far off. "Then we die on our feet," Marcus said. I looked at my brother's face, young and haunted and far too old. "There are some deaths worth dying," I whispered. He said nothing more after that, but I saw him nod. The plan took form slowly, built from pieces of observation gathered over months. Mistress Constance's habits were predictable in the way only those of the privileged can be. She drank her first glass of wine at sunset, her second during dinner, her third in the basement before the night's performance. She never stopped at 3. She always sat in the same chair. She always placed her journal on the same side table. The bell to summon help sat within reach, but her fingers were clumsy when she was deep in her cups. We learned her patterns the way she had learned ours. Marcus was to seize her wrist before she could ring the bell. Sarah would guard the door. The rest of us would form a circle around her, closing in like the bars of a cage. The wine bottle, always within her reach, would be the instrument of justice, not a knife, not a gun, not a rope, just the very object that had accompanied every act of her depravity. Her own ritual turned against her. We practiced in secret, not with words, but through work. While cleaning the parlor, Marcus would brush his hand near the bell to measure the distance. In the kitchen, Sarah would balance a bottle between her palms, learning its weight. I learned to move with the quiet grace of obedience masking fury. Every gesture rehearsed, every look calculated. And still, through it all, we lived the lie of normalcy. We worked, we smiled when spoken to, we bowed when ordered. Each morning we woke with the sun and carried our secret through the day like a hidden ember in our chests. The risk was unbearable. If even one of us faltered, if one word slipped to the wrong ear, all 12 would hang. There were moments when I lay awake in my quarters staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding loud enough to wake the others. I thought of my mother, long dead, who had taught me to read under the light of a stolen candle. She used to say that every word written down was an act of rebellion. Now I understood her. I was writing a story too, though not on paper. It was written in silence, in glances, in the rhythm of our breath. 3 months passed this way. Every day brought new tension, new fear. Mistress Constance seemed to sense that something had changed, but she could not name it. She scolded us more often, found fault in everything, too much salt in the stew, too little polish on the silver. She slapped Sarah across the face one afternoon for dropping a handkerchief. The next day she whipped Samuel for failing to bow low enough. Her cruelty became frantic, desperate. She was losing control, though she did not yet know it. Then came the day we had waited for, August 15th, 1851. The signs were all there. Master Edmund had left for New Orleans at dawn. The overseers had ridden out to inspect the cane fields. The house servants were dismissed early, sent to their quarters before sunset. The air was swollen with heat, the kind that makes even the insects too tired to move. When the call came, her voice floating down the hall like a serpent's hiss, none of us hesitated. "Violeta," she called, "bring the others. Tonight we celebrate 3 years of our little theater." I felt the words settle into me like a final nail driven home. In the mirror of the hall I caught my reflection. The thin cotton dress, the braid tight against my neck, the eyes that no longer belonged to the same woman who had walked these halls years before. Behind me, the others appeared one by one, silent and ready. It was strange how calm I felt. No trembling, no panic. Just the cold, clear certainty of someone who has already made peace with death. As we descended the steps to the basement, the sound of our bare feet on stone echoed like distant thunder. The lamps flickered ahead and the smell of perfume and wine drifted up to meet us. Mistress Constance sat waiting, her glass already full, her smile wide and bright. "Ah, my faithful ones," she said. "How fitting that you should be here for the anniversary." We took our places around her, exactly as we always had. But this time the performance belonged to us. The night air pressed thick against the plantation house like a living thing, hot and swollen and waiting. Even the crickets seemed to have gone silent, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath for what was about to come. The lamps in the great hall flickered as we passed, their light bending over the walls in restless shapes that trembled like guilty souls. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled over the bayou. It was distant, low but steady, like the growl of something ancient stirring beneath the surface of the earth. When Mistress Constance called us to her basement that August evening, the date was burned into my mind before I even reached the bottom step. August 15th, 1851, the night she chose the wrong show. I led the way down, my hand skimming the cold stone wall, counting each stair the way one counts heartbeats before a death. Behind me came the others, one by one, as silent as shadows. Marcus's breath was even and slow. Sarah's hands were clasped before her, her lips moving in some quiet prayer. Thomas, my brother, walked last. I didn't need to look at him to feel his presence. The air between us pulsed with shared memory. Pain and guilt braided together so tightly they had become the same thing. The door to the basement stood open, light spilling through like golden smoke. Inside, the familiar scent hit me, oil, perfume, and the sour, sweet edge of wine. Always the wine. It was everywhere. In the air, in her breath, in the stains on the rug that never truly washed out. Mistress Constance sat in her throne of red velvet, the color made darker by the low light. Her gown shimmered like poured honey, the silk catching every flicker of the lamps. On the table beside her rested the glass decanter, half empty already, and her leather-bound journal lay open to a blank page. She was writing history again, hers, not ours, and she meant for tonight's performance to be its crowning chapter. "My dear performers," she began, her voice sweet with wine, 3 years. Can you believe it? 3 years since we began our little experiment. We said nothing. Silence was our language now. "I thought," she continued, "we should celebrate the anniversary properly, something new, something transcendent." She smiled, and her teeth gleamed white in the lamplight. "Violeta, you and your brother will be tonight's centerpiece. You've always moved me the most." The words slid over my skin like a blade. The others stiffened, but we did not look at one another. We couldn't. Not yet. I bowed my head slightly, the way she expected, but my heart was no longer bending. It was steel. "Yes, ma'am," I said softly, though the words felt like ash on my tongue. "Good girl," she purred, lifting her glass. "You see, some lessons are never unlearned." She drank deeply, wine running over the edge of the glass and staining her lower lip crimson. When she set it down, she picked up her quill and dipped it into the ink. "Now then," she said, her voice brightening, "let's begin. Thomas, stand closer to your sister." Thomas didn't move. The stillness in him was terrifying, not because it was angry or rebellious, but because it was absolute, the kind of stillness that comes before a flood. "Did you not hear me, boy?" Mistress Constance demanded, her tone sharpening. "I said—" "No," I said. The quill stopped mid-air. The single syllable hung in the thick heat like a bell struck in a cathedral. It was the same word I had spoken months before, but this time it carried the weight of 12 people and 3 years of hell behind it. Her head turned slowly toward me, disbelief softening her face into something almost human. "What did you say?" I straightened. "I said, no, ma'am. We will not perform tonight." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone. Red liquid spread like blood across the floor, creeping toward the hem of her gown. "You forget yourself," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that was half shock, half disbelief. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" I stepped forward, feeling the rough stones through the soles of my bare feet. "Yes," I said, "I'm speaking to a woman who's about to lose everything she owns." Marcus moved first, as planned. His large frame filled the narrow space between her and the table. His hands came down on her shoulders, not roughly, not yet, but firm enough to let her feel the strength there. Sarah took her position by the door, her body small but unyielding. Isaiah and Ruth flanked the staircase. The others closed in, forming a loose circle that tightened with every heartbeat. Mistress Constance's composure cracked. Her eyes darted from face to face, calculating, searching for weakness. "You fools," she hissed. "If you touch me, you'll hang for it. Every one of you." Thomas spoke then, his voice low but clear. "Maybe so, but you'll die first." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on land. For the first time, she looked old. The fine lines around her eyes deepened, her painted lips trembling as the realization dawned that the script she had written no longer belonged to her. "Edmund!" she screamed suddenly, twisting in Marcus's grip. "Edmund, help me!" The sound bounced off the stone walls and went nowhere. I almost smiled. "He can't hear you," I said softly. "You built these walls too thick. You wanted privacy. You got it." She tried to jerk free, but Marcus's grip was unbreakable. The chair rocked under her, the velvet groaning. "Please," she said, now the word coming out strangled. "I'll free you. I'll give you money. You can go north, all of you. Just stop this madness." I shook my head slowly. "Madness? No, ma'am. This is clarity. For the first time, we see things as they are." Her gaze flicked to the journal on the table, and I saw a flash of calculation return to her eyes. "If you kill me," she said, "the others will know. My husband, the overseers, the law. They'll all come for you." "No one will know," I said. "We've been cleaning your messes for 3 years. One more won't be hard." Sarah reached behind her and turned the key in the heavy door. The metallic click echoed like a nail being driven into wood. That sound broke something in Mistress Constance. Her body began to tremble. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. "Please," she whispered again. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," I said. I walked toward the table, picked up the wine bottle, and held it to the light. The liquid inside glowed deep red, dark, and viscous. I turned it slowly in my hand, watching the lamplight ripple through it. "This has been your companion every night," I said. "You drank it when you planned our humiliation. You spilled it while you watched us suffer. Seems only right that it should be here now." Her eyes widened. "Violeta," she said, my name trembling on her tongue. "You don't have to." I raised the bottle slightly, silencing her. "Don't speak my name. You lost the right to use it when you made me an experiment." Behind me, the others closed in tighter. The air grew heavier, the lamps flickering in their glass. Somewhere far above, thunder cracked again, louder this time. Mistress Constance drew in one shaking breath. "You think this will make you free?" she said. "It won't. You'll still be slaves tomorrow." I looked at her, really looked. and saw not a monster but a coward in silk, a woman who had mistaken cruelty for power and fear for control. "Maybe," I said, "but tomorrow you'll be dead, and that's enough." Her scream was high and sharp, echoing off the stone, but no one upstairs heard it. The storm outside swallowed the sound whole. Marcus forced her back into the chair. Her hands clawed at the air, reaching for the bell, the journal, anything. I stepped forward, the bottle raised. The first strike shattered the glass against her temple, and the smell of wine exploded into the air, thick and sweet. She gasped, her hand flying to her head, eyes wide with disbelief. A crimson line bloomed across her forehead, dark and spreading. For a heartbeat, everything was still. No sound but the hiss of the lamps and the thunder rolling over the roof. Then she began to scream again, a raw animal sound that shook the dust from the rafters. Marcus held her down. Sarah covered her mouth. The others stood frozen, trembling, their eyes wide, with horror and relief. I felt nothing. No triumph, no mercy. Only the cold certainty that this was the only ending our story could ever have. As her blood mingled with the spilled wine on the floor, I leaned close to her ear and whispered, "You wanted a performance worthy of remembrance. Tonight you get your wish." Outside, the heavens opened. Rain hammered against the windows above, drumming like applause. The final act had begun. The word no had left my lips like a match touch to dry tinder. Small, almost fragile in sound, but it carried the heat of everything we had endured. By the time its echo faded into the stone, it was no longer a word. It was a force. It broke the air, unmaking the order of things. For years, that single word had been forbidden to us. We had learned to say yes to survive, yes to the whip, yes to the degradation, yes to every whim of those who claimed our bodies and silenced our souls. But in that basement, under the lamps that had witnessed our shame, no became something divine. It was rebellion and prayer, blade and salvation. The sound of glass cracking against Mistress Constance's skull had stunned even the air itself. The lamp flames wavered, bending as if recoiling from the act. Her body jerked once, her head striking the back of the velvet chair. And for a moment she went utterly still, wine dripping from her hair, her hand frozen mid-air as though she were about to conduct another performance. Then she screamed. The sound that tore from her throat was not human, not the sound of the woman who had played God in this chamber, but the sound of something being dragged out of the illusion of divinity and dropped into mortal terror. It was shrill and broken, scraping against the walls and bouncing back at us. The lamps flickered under the weight of it. Marcus didn't flinch. His hands clamped down on her shoulders, massive and steady, muscles coiled like ropes. Her fingers clawed at his wrists, but she could not move him. Sarah had her back to the door, her palms flat against the wood, eyes closed, whispering a hymn I barely remembered from my mother's voice. The others stood around us in a widening circle, 12 shadows converging, the smell of sweat and fear mingling with the perfume and the coppery sting of blood. Mistress Constance's voice cracked into words. "Stop! Stop this!" she gasped. "I'll give you freedom, I swear it. Papers, money, safe passage, north, anything." I moved closer. My heartbeat had slowed to a terrifying calm. Every sound inside me dulled except for the pulse in my ears. I could see the small beads of sweat collecting on her brow, the wine matting her dark hair to her temples. "Freedom," I said softly. "You speak it like a coin you can spend." Her eyes darted toward mine. "You think killing me will make you free?" she spat, her voice shaking. "They'll come for you. They'll make you beg for mercy until you curse the day you were born." I bent down so our faces were level. "You already made me curse that day," I said, "and I stopped begging long ago." She tried to strike me then, a wild swing born of desperation, but Marcus caught her wrist mid-air. She kicked against the chair, the silk of her dress twisting around her legs, the wine spreading in a dark stain across the fabric. Her fine slippers were soaked through. "Hold her," I said, my voice steady but distant in my own ears, as if someone else were speaking through me. The others moved forward in unison, as if pulled by invisible strings. Thomas reached for her arm. Sarah took the other. Isaiah and Ruth held her from behind. The chair creaked under the combined weight. Mistress Constance's eyes went wide, wild, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "Please," she whispered, "please don't do this." Her tears came fast now, washing tiny streaks through the rouge on her cheeks. She had cried before, of course. She was a skilled performer of emotion when it served her. But this was different. There was no performance left in her. The theater she had built around herself was collapsing, and for the first time she understood she was trapped inside it. "You called this place your theater," I said, lifting the broken neck of the bottle in my hand. "You said we were actors. You applauded when we wept. You kept notes on how we broke. So tonight, mistress, we'll play your final act. You'll have the starring role." She thrashed, but 12 people are stronger than one woman who's never known labor, never known fear until this moment. The sound of her struggle was almost rhythmic, the thud of feet against stone, the scrape of chair legs, the rasp of fabric. The air thickened with the smell of wine and blood until the line between them blurred. "Violeta," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "She'll choke." "That's the point," I said. Her head jerked toward me, eyes wide, mouth opening for another plea. But I tilted the bottle and wine poured into it instead. It hit her lips and overflowed, spilling down her chin, soaking her bodice. She coughed violently, sputtering as the liquid filled her mouth, but I did not stop. Every drop that touched her seemed to erase one of the nights she had stolen from us. "This," I said, my voice breaking for the first time, "is for Marcus, for the beatings, for the way you made him crawl while you wrote about his dignity." I poured again. She gagged, choking, red liquid spraying from her lips. Her hands clawed weakly at the air. "This," I whispered, "is for Sarah, for every tear you watched like it was theater." I tilted the bottle again. Her breath came in sharp, wet gasps. The lamplight shimmered against the streaks on her face. "And this," I said louder now, "is for Thomas." At his name she froze. Her eyes found his across the circle, and for an instant there was a flicker of recognition, as if she remembered the young boy she had destroyed in that same chair. "For his innocence," I said, and I poured the last of the wine. The dark liquid cascaded over her lips and down her throat. She coughed once, twice, then gasped, her whole body jerking violently as if rejecting both air and guilt. Her eyes rolled back, and a gurgling sound filled the silence where her voice had lived. We all watched. No one moved. No one spoke. When the final breath left her, it was not dramatic. It was small, soft, almost pitiful, the kind of sound you hear when a candle gutters out. Her head lolled to one side, the lamps hissed. Outside, lightning flashed through the narrow basement window, illuminating the scene in blinding white before plunging us back into shadow. It was over. For a moment I thought I might collapse. My knees trembled, my vision blurred at the edges. But then I looked at the others and strength returned. Marcus was breathing hard, his chest heaving. Sarah had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears spilling down her face. Thomas was staring at Mistress Constance's body as if trying to reconcile the sight with the memory of her power. Isaiah whispered, "She's gone." No one answered. We stood in the wreckage of her theater, surrounded by lamps still burning, their light soft and unreal. The rug beneath her chair was soaked in a dark mix of blood and wine. It looked almost beautiful in the flicker, like some painter's idea of martyrdom. Finally, I spoke. We have to clean. The practical words cut through the haze of shock. Marcus blinked, nodded once, and released her shoulders. Sarah lowered her trembling hands. Thomas turned away, leaning against the wall as if the sight of her were too heavy to bear. We do this now, I said, before the sun rises. There was no argument. We had done impossible tasks before, though never one that required so much precision born of desperation. The same hands that had been forced to polish silver now scrubbed stone. The same bodies that had been made to perform humiliation now moved with purpose, working to erase its final evidence. We righted the chair, straightened the lamps, poured fresh wine into a clean glass and set it near her limp hand. I washed the blood from the table and turned her head slightly to hide the wound beneath her hair. When we were done, she looked almost peaceful, like a woman who had simply drunk too deeply and fallen asleep. She always said her heart was delicate, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Let them believe it broke. I nodded. They will. We worked in silence until the first pale gray light touched the high window. By then the storm had passed and the air hung heavy and damp, carrying the scent of rain. When we finally climbed the stairs, none of us looked back. Above us, the house was still. The storm had scrubbed it clean of noise, leaving only the faint ticking of the long case clock in the hall. The world outside was waking, the first bird calls drifting through the open shutters. It felt obscene somehow that morning could come after a night like that. We did not speak of what we had done. There was nothing left to say. But as I walked past the parlor mirror, I caught my reflection. The same dress, the same face. But the eyes staring back were not those of a slave. They were the eyes of a woman who had said no and lived long enough to see what that word could do. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the world would never hear the same silence again. The storm that had raged outside slipped slowly into silence. A long, dragging quiet filled the basement, thicker than the smell of wine and blood that hung over everything. The lamps hissed and sputtered, their flames small from lack of oil. For the first time since we entered that chamber, the sound of Mistress Constance's breathing was gone. The absence of it was enormous. It seemed to stretch to the corners of the room like the space left behind when a bell stops ringing. We all stood there, unsure if we were alive or ghosts. Our bodies trembled not from fear, but from the shock of freedom we had never imagined could feel so heavy. Marcus sank to one knee beside the chair, his large hands dangling uselessly. Sarah leaned against the door, her head pressed to the wood as if listening for footsteps above. Thomas slid down the wall until he was sitting, his palms flat on the cold floor, eyes fixed on the woman we had just killed. I remember thinking that the basement suddenly looked smaller, like the walls had crept inward to claim what we had done. The wine pooled around her feet, turning the velvet of her gown a dull maroon. Her hair, once so carefully arranged, was unpinned and clinging to her face. The silver comb that had held it in place lay beside the chair, glittering faintly in the lamplight. I stared at it for a long time. It looked like something sacred and profane all at once, an artifact from a god that had died. Thomas's voice broke the stillness. Is she... He couldn't finish. I walked closer, each step loud in the hush. The air was thick enough to drink. I reached out and touched her wrist. Her skin was warm but slack, the pulse gone. Yes, I said, she's gone. The words should have sounded triumphant. Instead, they fell flat like a verdict we had waited years to hear but could not believe. No one cheered, no one wept. The only sound was the faint tapping of rain dripping from the window frame. Marcus exhaled, the breath rattling in his chest. Then it's done. Sarah shook her head slowly. Nothing's done, she whispered. Not until the house forgets. Her words were true. Killing her had been only the beginning. Now came the harder part, burying the truth in plain sight. The performance had to continue one last time, but this time the script was ours. We moved with the grim efficiency of people who had spent their whole lives cleaning up other people's messes. Marcus lifted the body from the chair while I straightened the rug and set the wine bottle back on the table, half filled with what was left. Sarah wiped the splattered blood from the stone with a rag that would later be burned. Thomas found a shawl in the corner and draped it around her shoulders to hide the ruin of her dress. The others rearranged the lamps, trimmed the wicks, made the scene look domestic, almost gentle. As we worked, my mind drifted. I saw flashes of all the nights that had led to this one. Her laughter when we cried, the scratch of her quill writing our suffering into neat lines of ink, the smell of the wine she sipped as she watched us. I saw the faces of the people she had broken and the small flickers of dignity she had tried to extinguish. All of it gathered inside me until it felt like I carried the weight of the whole plantation in my chest. When we were done, the basement looked almost peaceful. Mistress Constance sat slumped but composed, her head tilted slightly, her eyes closed as if she had merely drifted to sleep in her chair. The blood on the rug could have been spilled wine. The broken glass glimmered like decoration. It was obscene how easy it was to make death look like decadence. Marcus glanced toward the stairs. "We should go before someone comes looking." "No one will come," I said. "They never do. She wanted this room private." Still, we crept up the steps in single file, our bare feet silent against the wood. The house above was sleeping. The servants had long since gone to their quarters. The rain had cooled the air, leaving the smell of wet sugarcane drifting through the open shutters. For the first time in years, the house sounded natural. No laughter, no music, no false cheer. Just the creak of the timbers settling under the weight of the storm. In the kitchen, we stopped. The lantern there still burned low, casting a circle of amber light over the long wooden table. None of us spoke. There was no language for what we were now. We were no longer slaves in the way we had been an hour ago, but neither were we free. We were something between. People who had taken justice into their own hands and now had to live in the shadow of it. Thomas broke the silence. "What if they find her? What if they know?" "They won't," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm, certain. "They'll see what they expect to see, a woman who drank too much, a tragedy in silk." Sarah rubbed her arms, shivering though the air was warm. "And if they ask questions?" "Then we answer them like we always have," Marcus said. "With yes, ma'am, and no, sir." His voice was steady again. "We've been pretending our whole lives. We can pretend a little longer." We dispersed after that, each returning to our quarters as quietly as thieves. I remember walking through the dark corridor and feeling the floorboards tremble under my feet. I half expected the walls to cry out, to accuse us, but the house stayed silent. Maybe it understood. Maybe it was relieved. In my small room, I sat on the edge of the cot and stared at my hands. They were stained with wine and blood, and when I lifted them to the candlelight, they trembled. Not from guilt, though guilt was there, but from the strange knowledge that I was still alive. I thought of all the times I had wanted to die, of the nights when I had prayed for an end to the humiliation, and I realized that death was no longer my fear. The only thing that frightened me now was being found. I washed my hands in the basin, the water turning pink, then red, then clear again. The simple act of cleaning felt like an erasure of the past 3 years. When the basin was full of murky water, I carried it outside and poured it into the earth, watching it sink into the mud. The ground accepted it without question. Dawn came pale and slow. The sky over the cane fields was the color of bruised peaches. The overseers rode out to the fields as they always did, shouting orders, cracking whips, unaware that their mistress would never shout again. The plantation moved forward on habit alone, the machinery of cruelty still turning though its operator was gone. By mid-morning, the news spread. Mistress Constance had been found in her private chamber dead from an excess of wine. The doctor said her heart had stopped. The master returned from New Orleans 2 days later, his grief loud and theatrical. He never asked questions that might bring shame to the family. The basement was sealed, the key locked away. The official story was written before noon, and the truth was buried deeper than her body ever would be. The days that followed passed in a haze. The 12 of us moved through the house like ghosts, careful, obedient, efficient. No one suspected. When they spoke of her, they used soft voices, poor lady, so refined, so delicate. I served the mourners at her funeral, pouring wine into their glasses while the scent of the same vintage clung to my memory. Not one of them noticed the tremor in my hands. At night I dreamed of the basement, the flickering lamps, the pool of red, the sound of thunder rolling like applause. But in the dream, she wasn't screaming anymore. She was quiet, watching from her chair with an expression I couldn't name. Not anger, not forgiveness, just a kind of knowing. I would wake soaked in sweat, my throat raw from the screams I never let out. Weeks turned into months. Master Edmund aged 10 years in one season. He began drinking from the same decanter she had favored. I sometimes saw him standing at the window of the parlor, glass in hand, staring out over the fields as though searching for her ghost. Maybe he found it. I never asked. The rest of us carried on the way people do when there is no choice. Marcus worked the fields with silent endurance. Sarah moved through the house like a shadow, her eyes always down. Thomas rarely spoke. Each of us bore our secret like a wound stitched shut too soon, healed on the surface, festering underneath. Yet even in that silence there was a kind of peace. We had taken back something no whip could strip away. The act itself had given us proof of our humanity, though it had cost us whatever innocence slavery had not already stolen. When I looked at the others, I saw not servants but survivors, bound together by a truth that would never be spoken. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand at the window and watch lightning flicker far off over the swamp. The thunder would roll a few seconds later, deep and steady, and I would think of that night, the storm, the wine, the blood. I would whisper to the dark, "It is done." And though the wind never answered, I always felt that the world had heard me. The theater of shame was closed forever. Its final performance had been written not with ink, but with the unyielding will of the people she had tried to erase. The curtain had fallen in blood and wine, and beneath it we stood, shaking, trembling, but unbroken. Mourning on a plantation after rain is a strange thing. The world smells clean, but the ground remembers. The mud holds its prints like a ledger. When I stepped out of my quarters the next day, the sky was a washed-out gray, and steam rose off the fields as if the earth itself were sighing. The air was quiet in a way I had never known it to be. No voice calling from the main house, no bells summoning the house servants, no sharp click of Mistress Constance's heels on the veranda. Just the low buzz of flies and the slap of bare feet in mud. We had slept only a few hours. Sleep is not the word for what it was. It was more a collapse, a fall into darkness so deep that dreams couldn't reach us. When the dawn came, each of us woke with the same question in our eyes. Had it really happened? But the silence of the house answered for us. By mid-morning, the rumor began to spread. Mistress Constance Whitmore was dead. Some said she had fallen, others whispered she had taken too much wine and choked in her sleep. No one spoke of murder. No one ever would. We had given the world a story it preferred, and the world was eager to believe it. From my window I saw the carriage returning from town carrying Dr. Morrison, a thin man with a face like dried paper. He had been the plantation doctor for 15 years, more accustomed to treating the master's gout than the slave's wounds. He walked into the house with a black bag and walked out 2 hours later shaking his head. I watched him speak to the overseer, then to Sarah, who was serving coffee to the visitors. She nodded at his words with perfect composure, her face a mask of sorrow so convincing it might have fooled God himself. "She took ill in the night," I heard her say. "The wine, sir. She never could hold her wine." Dr. Morrison made a note in his ledger. "Cause of death," he murmured. "Heart. Failure brought on by overindulgence. A tragedy of excess." He did not look toward us again. When Master Edmund returned the next morning from New Orleans, the news met him at the door. I stood in the hall with the other house servants as he entered. His boots were caked with dust, his eyes shadowed from travel. At the sight of the black veil on the parlor mirror, his face crumpled. He staggered as if the air had struck him. "Where is she?" he demanded. "In the basement, sir," the overseer said softly. "The doctor says she passed peacefully." Peacefully. The word hung like a mockery. I saw Marcus's hands clench behind his back. Master Edmund went below. He stayed there a long time. When he emerged, his face was gray, his eyes hollow. He carried her journal in his hands but did not open it. Later that day, I saw him drop it into the fireplace and watch the pages curl into ash. Maybe he feared what truths it contained, maybe he already knew. The house entered a period of mourning. The mirrors were covered, the piano closed, the parlor curtains drawn. Black ribbons fluttered from the porch railings, a sign to the neighbors that the lady of the house had gone to her eternal rest. Visitors came from miles around to pay respects. They spoke in low voices about the tragic loss of a refined woman taken too soon. I poured wine for them, the same wine that had ended her life. None of them noticed my hands shake as I filled their glasses. "She was a pillar of virtue," said Mrs. Davidson from the neighboring estate. "A bit of a temper, perhaps, but so gracious." "Gracious," I repeated under my breath, the word burning like acid. The funeral was held 3 days later beneath the oak tree by the river. The rain had turned the ground to thick clay, and the gravediggers cursed quietly as they worked. I stood with the other house slaves behind the mourners, our faces properly somber. The master wept openly at the graveside, his shoulders shaking with grief or guilt. I could not tell which. When the coffin was lowered, I felt no joy, no sorrow. Only the strange hollowness of a stage emptied after the final curtain. That night the house was so quiet I could hear the moths battering against the lamps. One by one, the 12 of us met behind the laundry shed. No words were needed. We stood in a circle beneath the weeping willow, the moonlight slicing through its branches in silver threads. Marcus spoke first. "It's done," he said. "Don't speak of it again." His voice was low but certain. We all nodded. That was our pact. Silence would be our freedom. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the plantation returned, though something in its heart had changed. Master Edmund walked as if half asleep, drinking more each day. He stopped holding Sunday services and took his meals alone. The overseer assumed more authority, but even he seemed muted, his whip used more for show than fury. Perhaps some echo of that night had traveled through the walls after all. The basement was sealed a month later. The master ordered the door barred and the key buried in his desk. He told the workers it was for repairs, that the room was no longer fit for use. I watched them hammer the planks into place, each blow of the mallet reverberating through my chest. When the final nail was driven, a gust of air escaped from the crack, carrying the faint smell of wine. Then it was over. The theater was buried. Life settled into its strange new order. The 12 of us still labored, still answered to the bells, but there was an unspoken dignity between us now. When we passed one another in the yard, our eyes met for a heartbeat longer than they should have. We were bound by something greater than chains, a shared secret that made us dangerous even in our silence. At night in the quarters, the story began to whisper itself among the others. Not the whole truth, never that, but fragments distorted by fear and hope. They spoke of a lady who had angered the spirits and been claimed by them. Some said the wine in her glass had turned to blood. Others swore they heard her screams in the storm that night. We let the myth grow. It was safer that way. Months passed into a year. Then the master announced he would sell the estate and move north. "I cannot breathe in this house," he told the doctor. "Every room smells of her." Within weeks, the auction posters appeared. The slaves were listed as inventory, men, women, children, each with a price beside their names. The 12 of us read the lists in silence, our hearts pounding. Freedom had come in one form and now threatened to scatter us in another. The night before the sale, we met again in the same spot behind the laundry shed. No lamps, only moonlight and memory. We stood close, not touching, but near enough to feel each other's breath. No one spoke until Sarah whispered, "What we did. Was it sin or salvation?" Marcus answered after a long moment. "It was justice," he said. "Sin is a word for people who never been owned." I looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and indifferent. "We won't see each other again," I said. It was not a question. They all knew it. We keep the secret wherever we go. It's ours alone. Each of them nodded. Then we went our separate ways. The auction took 3 days. Families were split, names changed, lives rewritten on paper. I was sold to a cotton plantation in Texas. Marcus went to Mississippi, Sarah to Georgia. Thomas was bought by a planter from Alabama. As the wagon pulled away from Whitmore, I looked back one last time. The house stood white and still against the sky, the black ribbons long since removed. Somewhere beneath that foundation, our past lay entombed in planks and stone. No one would ever dig there. Years unfolded. The war came, and with it the slow crumbling of the world that had made us slaves. When emancipation was finally declared, I was 42 years old. I walked out into the Texas sun and felt its heat on my skin as if for the first time. The others I knew of only through rumor. Marcus had become a farmer on his own land. Sarah a teacher in a school for freed children. Thomas a preacher who spoke of deliverance without ever naming the deliverance we had taken for ourselves. Sometimes I wondered if they still dreamed of that night. I did. Always. In my dreams, the basement was not a place of blood, but of firelight and freedom. Mistress Constance sat in her chair, but she was no longer a woman. She was an idea, power itself, fading as the lamps burned low. When I woke, I would feel the weight lift for a moment before returning. In the years after freedom, I learned to sew and earned enough to buy a small house in Austin. I lived quietly, mending clothes, teaching young girls their letters in secret the way my mother once taught me. No one there knew who I had been or what I had done. When people spoke of the Whitmore plantation, it was as a ruin haunted by its own past. They said a school for colored children would be built on its grounds. The irony made me smile. A place once used to destroy souls would now teach them to fly. Even so, the mask never fully came off. To the world, I was a quiet woman, proper and pious. Only at night, when the lamps burned low, did I speak to the shadows. I would whisper, "Do you remember?" And in the soft rustle of the curtains, I swore I heard 12 voices answer. We had worn the mask again as we always had to, but underneath it we were still the 12 who refused. The years after freedom were a slow kind of healing. I used to believe that the end of slavery would feel like a sunrise, sudden, golden, erasing the night in a single sweep of light. But it was not like that. Freedom came softly like dawn through fog. It touched the edges of things first, a law, a word, a rumor, before it ever reached our bones. For many of us, it never reached them at all. I settled in Austin after the war, a city still half rubble, half promise. The air smelled of dust and sawdust, of new foundations laid over old wounds. I rented a small wooden house near the river, nothing more than 2 rooms and a narrow porch, but it was mine. No master's voice echoed down the hallway. No footsteps came behind me. No locked doors waited at the bottom of the stairs. It was the first time in my life I had ever closed a door and known that it was only to keep the wind out. I made a living sewing. My mother had taught me to stitch before she died, her hands moving quickly in the dark while she whispered lessons the law forbade. In time, the white women of Austin came to know me as Miss Violeta, the quiet seamstress, never suspecting that my fingers, so careful with their lace and thread, had once gripped a wine bottle in a darker kind of work. They called me respectable. I smiled and thanked them. Respectability was another mask, and I had worn masks long enough to know how to breathe behind them. Some nights I would walk to the edge of the river and listen to the frogs and crickets singing in the reeds. I would think of the others, Marcus, Sarah, Thomas, the 12 who had stood with me in the chamber beneath the Whitmore house. I wondered if they were still alive, if they too had found quiet corners of the world where their ghosts could rest. Sometimes, when the wind came across the water just right, I could almost hear their voices blending with the night sounds. It comforted me to imagine that the bayou carried our story on its breath. The years passed. The world turned. Children were born who had never seen a chain, who learned to read from the Bible and sang hymns that spoke of deliverance. I took joy in teaching some of them their letters. They would sit on my porch in the afternoons, their feet swinging above the dusty boards, repeating after me as I traced words with chalk on a piece of slate. Freedom, dignity, justice. They spoke the words easily, like birds learning a song, not knowing the cost of them. I never told them. Some truths are too heavy for young shoulders. But when they asked me about slavery, what it was really like, I would tell them stories, not of the beatings or the hunger or the chains, but of the people who endured them. I spoke of mothers who taught their children to sing when they had no words left, of men who hid other men in the swamps and sent them north under the cover of night, of women who prayed with one hand and sharpened knives with the other. I told them that survival itself was resistance, that every breath we took was an act of defiance. I never told them about Mistress Constance Whitmore. That story was not for children. That story belonged to the night, to the storm, to the basement we sealed with our silence. Still, stories have a way of escaping. Somewhere, somehow, the truth began to grow into legend. People whispered of a Louisiana plantation where a cruel mistress had vanished during a summer storm. Her death so mysterious that even the master never spoke her name again. They said the slaves had risen against her, that the walls of her house had swallowed her whole. Others said she had been cursed, dragged to hell by the spirits she had tormented. The story traveled along the riverboats across the fields from mouth to mouth. By the time I was an old woman, the legend had a name: the 12 who refused. It was no longer about us, not really. It was about what we had come to represent. To some, we were demons. To others, saints. I once overheard 2 freedmen arguing in the market about us. One of them slit her throat clean through, one said, shaking his head. They say her ghost still walks that plantation. No, said the other. They didn't kill her. The Lord took her himself. Those 12 were angels. I didn't correct either of them. I only smiled to myself and thought, let them choose whichever truth helps them sleep at night. When I turned 70, I decided to write the story down. Not the legend, but the truth, the one no one else could tell. My hands shook as I wrote, the ink sometimes blotting on the page, but the words came steady. I wrote of the 3 years in the basement, of the humiliation, the silence, the night of the storm. I wrote of how the wine smelled when it spilled, how her blood had mingled with it until they were indistinguishable. I wrote of the 12 of us standing afterward, too shocked to pray. I wrote it not to confess, but to remember. I hid the pages beneath the floorboard of my small house. I told no one. Maybe someday someone will find them. Maybe they won't. The truth is a dangerous thing. Even in freedom, it can burn you alive. When I was 72, I fell ill. My body, once so full of strength and anger, began to weaken like an old tree whose roots had rotted. My granddaughter Clara tended to me. She was 15, bright as a new coin, her eyes full of a world I had never seen. One with schools and elections, with talk of rights and progress. Sometimes she would read to me by the lamplight. Her voice was soft, and I would close my eyes and let the words wash over me. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she asked, "Grandmother, were you ever afraid?" I smiled. "Every day of my life," I said. "And how did you stop being afraid?" I thought about that for a long time. "You don't," I said finally. "You just stop letting fear decide what you will do." That night I dreamed again of the basement, but it was different this time. The room was bright, the lamps clean and full, the air sweet. The chair where Mistress Constance had sat was empty. The walls were gone. In their place was a wide field of cotton turned to gold by the sun. The 12 of us stood together, not in rags but in Sunday best, our faces calm. Marcus held a plow. Sarah carried a book. Thomas had a Bible tucked under his arm. When I looked down, I saw that my hands were clean. I woke with tears on my face, but they were not sad tears. They were the kind that come when a long journey ends. On November 3rd, 1895, I died in my sleep, surrounded by the family I had built in freedom. They said I looked peaceful. I hope that was true. At my funeral, more than 200 people came. Freedmen, their children, and their children's children. The preacher spoke of endurance and faith. He did not know the story beneath my quiet life, but perhaps he sensed it. When they lowered me into the earth, the sky was overcast and a soft rain began to fall. The drops struck the wooden coffin like the slow rhythm of distant applause. Years later, I heard they built a school on the old Whitmore land. A school for colored children. The basement had been filled with stone long before, the house itself torn down to make room for classrooms. No one knew what had happened there. No one knew that beneath their feet, buried in silence, lay the bones of a woman and the memory of 12 who refused to kneel. Sometimes I imagine the children sitting at their desks, reciting lessons, laughing, their voices rising in the same air that had once carried screams. It comforts me. It feels like the earth's own kind of forgiveness, not for her, but for us. The story of the 12 who refused became legend, and legend became symbol. It traveled far beyond Louisiana, told in whispers around fires, sung in work songs, written in pamphlets passed hand to hand. It grew until it belonged to everyone who had ever said no when the world demanded yes. And though my name faded, I know that somewhere in the quiet places where stories are born, Violeta still lives. Not as a slave, not even as an avenger, but as a woman who dared to speak the forbidden word and lived to see its echo change the world. Because in the end, the act was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, our voices, our dignity, our right to say no. And that, I think, is what freedom truly is.